What happens when the border between two nations is drawn in just 5 weeks? Most borders in the modern world emerged slowly, shaped by wars, treaties, and the rise and fall of kingdoms. The line that came to separate India from Pakistan was different. It appeared almost overnight, less the product of history than of a deadline. In the summer of 1947, a single man sat in a hot bungalow in Delhi with a stack of maps and census reports, and in just over a month, he was expected to create a frontier that would divide nearly 90 million people. He had never been to India before, he did not understand its languages, and he had little time to consult those who lived along the line he was about to draw. Yet what he produced would shape the history of South Asia for the next 70 years. The partition of India is remembered most vividly through its human cost. Refugees boarded trains in the hope of reaching safety, only for many of those journeys to end in violence. On the roads, families walked for days at a time, unsure if they would ever see their homes again. In places like Punjab and Bengal, the upheaval tipped into bloodshed, leaving entire regions marked by fear and grief. How could something so immense have been arranged with so little preparation? Partition was treated less like the birth of two nations and more like an administrative exercise, forced into a timetable that left no room for planning, adjustment, or mercy. To see how the stage was set, we need to look back at the British Raj. For almost 2 centuries, Britain had controlled India with a combination of force and administration. The railways, the postal system, and the legal codes are often remembered as symbols of modernization, but beneath them lay a system of governance that depended on exploiting differences within Indian society. India was not a single unit when Britain expanded its rule in the 19th century. It was a mosaic of languages, regions, castes, and religions. Rather than smoothing those differences over, colonial officials hardened them. Beginning in the late 1800s, the census categorized Indians primarily by religion, making Hindu and Muslim identities more central to politics than they had been before. Electoral reforms introduced in the early 20th century created separate electorates, meaning Muslims voted for Muslim candidates and Hindus for Hindu ones. These measures were defended as democratic, but in practice, they turned diversity into rivalry. The British also experimented with partition long before 1947. In 1905, Bengal was divided into Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority halves, provoking massive protests that eventually forced the reversal of the plan. Although Bengal was reunited in 1911, the memory of division lingered. In Punjab, another region with a mixed population, colonial land policies tied Sikh farmers, Muslim landlords, and Hindu traders into competing economic networks that depended heavily on the state. The Raj was skilled at playing communities against each other, and in doing so, it created political fault lines that would deepen when the empire began to withdraw. By the 1940s, Britain's hold on India was weakening. The Second World War drained Britain of resources and exposed the vulnerability of empire. Indian leaders saw an opportunity. The Congress Party, which had grown into a mass movement, launched the Quit India campaign in 1942. It was brutally suppressed, but it showed that millions were no longer willing to wait patiently for reform. At the same time, the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was pressing its claim that Muslims required their own homeland. For decades, the League had struggled to match the popularity of Congress, but as communal riots broke out in Bengal and Bihar, the demand for Pakistan gained traction. Jinnah presented it as a safeguard against Hindu domination, and many Muslims believed that without separation, they would become permanent minorities in a Hindu-led India. The war accelerated the timetable. When victory came in 1945, Britain was exhausted. The Labour government elected that year concluded that India had to be granted independence quickly. In 1946, it announced that power would be transferred no later than June 1948. But as riots spread in Bengal and Punjab, fears grew that waiting even that long would plunge the subcontinent into civil war before independence arrived. Into this situation stepped Lord Louis Mountbatten, appointed viceroy in March 1947. He was given the task of overseeing Britain's withdrawal and finding a political settlement. Mountbatten quickly decided that unity was impossible. Congress leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi still hoped for a single India, but Jinnah and the League demanded Pakistan and refused compromise. Mountbatten believed that the only way to prevent the country from descending into chaos was to accept partition. What made his decision extraordinary was not just the choice itself, but the speed at which he carried it out. Britain had promised to leave by June 1948. Mountbatten announced that independence would instead come in August 1947, less than 6 months after his arrival. The empire that had ruled India for nearly 2 centuries was now preparing to leave in a matter of weeks. This acceleration turned partition into a logistical nightmare. There was no time to prepare for the movement of millions of people, no time to build the infrastructure that might have made migration safer, and no time to carefully consider how to divide some of the most complex and densely populated regions on Earth. It was at this point that the task of drawing the actual border became unavoidable. The decision had been made to create two dominions, India and Pakistan. But what precisely would Pakistan look like on a map? Bengal and Punjab were to be divided, but both provinces were mixed, with Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs living side by side. Villages, rivers, markets, even family households often crossed religious boundaries. Mountbatten needed someone to chair the boundary commissions for Punjab and Bengal. The man chosen was Cyril Radcliffe, a British barrister who had never been to India before and who knew little about its geography or culture. Radcliffe was respected as a lawyer, but he was not a cartographer, a historian, or a political expert. What he did have, in the eyes of the British government, was neutrality, no connections to any Indian community, and therefore, no personal bias. Radcliffe arrived in Delhi in July 1947. He was given a bungalow, a staff of assistants, and 5 weeks to produce a border. Cyril Radcliffe had barely stepped off the ship before he was plunged into one of the most consequential assignments of the 20th century. He had never been to India before, knew little about its people, and now found himself responsible for dividing two of its most complex provinces. The boundary commissions for Punjab and Bengal were nominally joint bodies with representatives from Congress, the Muslim League, and the Sikhs. In reality, Radcliffe held the deciding vote. He was to weigh census figures, maps, and arguments, and in a matter of weeks, decide which towns and villages would belong to India and which would belong to Pakistan. The problem was that the data he worked from could not capture the human complexity of the regions he was dividing. Punjab was a land of intertwined communities, where Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs had lived side by side for centuries. Villages were rarely homogeneous, and even where religious majorities existed, minorities were woven into the fabric of local life. Bengal posed similar challenges, with its patchwork of Hindus and Muslims sharing rivers, farmland, and markets. To draw a neat line between them was impossible, yet that was precisely what Radcliffe was expected to do. The timetable made the task even more unrealistic. Radcliffe was given 5 weeks, in the height of summer, in a Delhi bungalow where the heat routinely topped 40 degrees Celsius. He had stacks of census records, many of them outdated or unreliable, and maps that could not reflect the ground-level reality. He had little opportunity to consult local leaders or communities. When he asked for more time, he was told that none could be spared. Independence Day was set for mid-August, and the border had to be ready. Radcliffe approached the task like a lawyer rather than a geographer. He listened to the arguments presented by each side, weighed them against the census figures, and tried to produce what he described as a fair compromise. But compromise on this scale meant splitting towns, districts, and even families. In Punjab, the historic city of Lahore went to Pakistan, while Amritsar went to India, leaving Sikh holy sites scattered across both sides of the line. In Bengal, the city of Calcutta, with its vital port, was awarded to India, while East Bengal became Pakistan. That eastern wing, separated from West Pakistan by the entire breadth of India, became known as East Pakistan. It would remain tied uneasily to its western counterpart for just over 2 decades, before breaking away to form Bangladesh in 1971. The decisions were kept secret until after independence. Mountbatten and his advisors feared that if the award were published in advance, it would trigger violence before the British had even left. So Radcliffe worked under pressure and in silence, completing his maps only days before the ceremonies of independence in Delhi and Karachi. When he returned to Britain, he burned his papers, declaring that he did not want to be reminded of the work that he had done. On the 15th of August, 1947, India celebrated its freedom. Jawaharlal Nehru spoke of a tryst with destiny, and in Karachi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah declared Pakistan's independence. But as flags were raised and speeches delivered, the actual location of the border was still unknown to most people. Radcliffe's line was revealed only after the ceremonies, and the shock was immediate. Villages found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the frontier. Families discovered that the land they had tilled for generations now belonged to another country. Entire communities realized that they had become minorities overnight. The result was the largest migration in human history. More than 14 million people left their homes, trying to cross into the country where they thought they would be safe. Hindus and Sikhs fled from Pakistan into India, while Muslims fled from India into Pakistan. The migrations were chaotic and poorly organized. Trains overloaded with refugees struggled along broken tracks. Caravans of families walked for hundreds of miles, carrying what little they could salvage. In Bengal, millions moved across the new line between India and East Pakistan, beginning a displacement that would echo decades later when East Pakistan itself fought for independence. The movement of so many people created opportunities for violence. Militias, gangs, and armed bands attacked refugee columns. Trains full of migrants were ambushed, leaving only corpses behind. In Punjab especially, the violence reached terrifying proportions. Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim villages turned on one another in waves of retribution. Women were abducted, homes burned, and fields left deserted. Estimates of the dead vary, but most historians believe that at least 1 million people were killed, with some estimates rising as high as 2 million. The numbers are staggering, but they capture only part of the devastation. Millions more were scarred by trauma, separated from family members, or condemned to lives of exile. The speed of Britain's withdrawal meant that no adequate security arrangements were in place. The new governments of India and Pakistan were barely established, struggling to form administrations even as violence consumed their borderlands. British troops, once the guarantors of order, had already departed. Partition was not just a line on a map, it was a collapse of authority that unleashed the fury of communities already primed by decades of mistrust. Even as the bloodshed unfolded, the map remained unsettled. One of the most consequential decisions left unresolved was the fate of the princely states. These territories, ruled by local monarchs under British suzerainty, were technically free to choose whether to join India or Pakistan. Most did so quickly, but Kashmir proved different. Its ruler was Hindu, its population majority Muslim, and its strategic location at the headwaters of the Indus made it vital to both countries. When tribal militias from Pakistan invaded, the ruler turned to India for help, triggering the First Indo-Pakistani War. The conflict ended with Kashmir divided, and it has remained a source of tension and war ever since. Partition had been presented as a solution to communal conflict, a clean break that would allow Hindus and Muslims to flourish in their own states. Instead, it created new disputes and hardened divisions that still shape South Asia today. The hasty drawing of the border not only led to immediate massacres, but left behind unresolved issues that have sparked repeated wars between India and Pakistan. Cyril Radcliffe returned to England only days after delivering his maps. He never returned to India and later admitted that he could not bear to think about the suffering that followed. He had done the job he was asked to do, under impossible conditions, but he recognized that his lines on the map had helped unleash catastrophe. Lord Mountbatten, who had accelerated the timetable, defended his decisions until his death, arguing that delay would only have made matters worse. Yet for millions of Indians and Pakistanis, the memory of 1947 became a memory of betrayal and abandonment. The partition of India is remembered both as a moment of liberation and as a tragedy. Independence was a triumph of decades of struggle, but the way it was carried out ensured that freedom came hand in hand with violence. The British decision to leave quickly, the appointment of an inexperienced lawyer to divide a subcontinent, and the secrecy of the process all combined to make conflict inevitable. And the new Pakistan that emerged was itself unstable. Its eastern half, separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory and divided by language and culture from the west, would eventually break away in 1971 to form Bangladesh. Partition had not only created two nations where one had stood, but set in motion a process of fragmentation that reshaped South Asia again within a single generation. Today, the borders drawn in 1947 remain among the most fraught in the world. They are lines of sovereignty, but also lines of memory and trauma. Families still trace their origins to towns they were forced to leave. Communities still recall the massacres that destroyed their neighborhoods. The subcontinent has moved forward, building nations with enormous cultural and political weight, but the scars of partition have never fully healed. When we look back at the summer of 1947, it is tempting to imagine alternatives. More time, more preparation, more consideration for the people who would live with the consequences. But the reality is that history does not allow rehearsals. The map was drawn in 5 weeks, the border was announced in secrecy, and millions paid the price. Independence was achieved, but it came with a cost that no line on a map can ever measure.